The metal shackles bit into Josephine O'Malley's wrists as she stood trembling upon the wooden auction block, the afternoon sun beating down mercilessly on her tear-stained face. Fort Benton, Montana Territory, 1876, a place she once called home had become her prison, and now her marketplace. Next up, gentlemen, this fine young woman to pay off her father's gambling debts. $500 starting bid for this healthy 20-year-old. She can cook, clean, and do whatever else you might fancy. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty town square as curious onlookers gathered, some with pity in their eyes, others with something far more sinister. Josephine fought back tears as she surveyed the crowd. Her father had vanished 3 weeks ago, leaving behind nothing but debts and a note apologizing for what he'd done. The creditors had been quick to collect, and when they found nothing of value in their modest home, they decided his daughter would fetch a fair price. Near the back of the crowd, Quincy Nash watched with narrowed eyes, his weathered Stetson pulled low over his brow. At 32, he'd spent most of his life building up his small cattle ranch outside of town, saving every penny after losing his parents to cholera when he was barely 18. His calloused hand gripped the leather pouch containing his entire life savings, $800 meant for expanding his herd. $600, came a shout from the front. Josephine flinched as she recognized Wilbur Hadley's voice, the owner of the saloon who'd been eyeing her for years. He was a cruel man with wandering hands and a mean disposition, especially when drunk. $650, called another voice. Quincy had seen Josephine around town before the quiet, hard-working daughter of Thomas O'Malley, a man who'd never met a card game he didn't like or couldn't lose. She'd always been kind, helping at the church socials and mending clothes for extra money. Something in his chest tightened at the thought of her fate if she fell into Hadley's hands. $700. Hadley's voice rang out again, and Josephine closed her eyes, a single tear escaping down her cheek. Quincy pushed forward through the crowd. This wasn't right. No person should be sold like cattle. Without thinking further, he called out, $800. A hush fell over the crowd. That was a small fortune in Fort Benton. The auctioneer, a thin man with a waxed mustache, looked surprised. $800 once, twice. He glanced at Hadley, who scowled but shook his head. Sold to the gentleman in the back. Josephine's eyes flew open, searching the crowd until they landed on Quincy Nash. She knew of him, the quiet rancher who kept to himself, but always tipped his hat politely when they passed on the street. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by shame and uncertainty. What would he expect of her now that he'd paid such a sum? Quincy made his way forward, emptying his pouch into the auctioneer's greedy hands. He approached the auction block as the sheriff removed Josephine's shackles. "Mr. Nash," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Miss O'Malley," he replied, avoiding her gaze. "My wagon's over yonder, if you'd care to join me." The sheriff handed Quincy a bill of sale, a document claiming ownership of another human being. It made his stomach turn. He crumpled it into his pocket without looking at it. They walked in silence to his wagon, acutely aware of the stares following them. Josephine stumbled once, weak from days with little food, and Quincy instinctively reached out to steady her, his touch gentle on her arm. "Thank you," she whispered. Once seated in his wagon, Quincy finally spoke. "I want you to know I don't hold to owning people. That paper means nothing to me." Josephine's hands twisted in her lap. "But you paid your savings for me. Surely you expect something in return." "The only thing I expect," he said firmly, "is that you're treated with the dignity every person deserves." "Why?" Her voice caught. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Quincy flicked the reins, setting the horses in motion. Because my pa always said a man who stands by while injustice happens is just as guilty as the one causing it. As they left Fort Benton behind, Josephine stared at the man beside her, this quiet cowboy who just spent everything he had to save her. She didn't know what awaited her at his ranch, but for the first time in weeks she felt something like hope. "What will happen to me now?" she asked as the town disappeared behind them. "That's for you to decide, Miss O'Malley, but for now you need food and rest." He glanced at her briefly. "And you're safe. I promise you that." The ranch came into view as they crested a hill, a modest cabin with a barn, corral, and rolling pastures where cattle grazed. It wasn't grand, but it was neat and well tended. "It's not much," he said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's beautiful," she answered honestly, taking in the wildflowers growing along the fence line and the smoke curling from the chimney. As they pulled up to the cabin, an older woman stepped onto the porch, her gray hair pulled back in a bun, her expression curious. "This is Mrs. Larson," Quincy explained. "She helps around the place a few days a week." Mrs. Larson's eyebrows rose at the sight of Josephine, but she said nothing as Quincy briefly explained the situation. "Well then," the older woman said, taking charge, "let's get you inside, dear. You look like you could use a hot meal and a bath." Later that evening, after a filling supper and the first proper bath she'd had in weeks, Josephine sat wrapped in a borrowed nightgown and quilt on a chair by the fire. Quincy had insisted she take his bedroom while he slept in the barn. "You didn't have to give up your bed," she said when he brought in more firewood. "I've slept in worse places," he replied, keeping a respectful distance in the firelight. Josephine studied him, tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and hands roughened by work. His dark hair curled at the nape of his neck, and when he glanced at her, his eyes were a surprising shade of blue. "Why did you really buy me, Mr. Nash?" He stacked the wood carefully. "I didn't buy you. I paid a debt that should never have been yours to bear. But all your savings. Money can be earned again. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Quincy straightened, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. "You don't need to repay me, Miss O'Malley. But if you're determined, Mrs. Larson is getting on in years. She could use help with the cooking and such. I'll pay fair wages, and when you've saved enough to make your own way, you're free to go wherever you please. You would do that. Just let me go. You were never mine to keep." That night, lying in his bed surrounded by the scent of pine soap and leather that seemed to cling to everything he owned, Josephine wept not from fear or sorrow, but from overwhelming gratitude. Whatever God or fate had placed Quincy Nash at that auction, she thanked them with all her heart. The following weeks established a routine. Josephine helped Mrs. Larson with the household tasks, learned to cook on the temperamental wood stove, and gradually regained her strength. Quincy worked from dawn until dusk, tending cattle, mending fences, and only coming inside for meals. "Does he always work so hard?" Josephine asked Mrs. Larson one afternoon as they kneaded bread dough and watched Quincy repairing the corral through the window. "That boy hasn't stopped working since his folks passed," Mrs. Larson replied. "Built this place from nothing but determination and grit. Never takes time for himself." "He's a good man," Josephine said softly. "The best I know," the older woman agreed. "Though he's as stubborn as that mule of his. Keeps everyone at arm's length since Rachel, his sweetheart years back, promised to marry him, then ran off with a railroad man who promised her fine things in San Francisco." Mrs. Larson shook her head. Quincy had just started building this place for her. Josephine felt a pang in her chest. "He's been alone all this time, by choice. Plenty of young ladies would welcome his attention, but he keeps to himself. Says the ranch is company enough." Mrs. Larson gave Josephine a pointed look. "Though he's been fixing up the place something fierce since you arrived." "Indeed." Josephine had noticed new curtains appearing in the windows, a rocking chair on the porch, and fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table each morning. Quincy never mentioned these touches, and she never asked, but warmth bloomed in her chest each time she discovered a new one. 1 month after her arrival, Josephine was hanging laundry when a wagon approached. Her heart stuttered when she recognized Wilbur Hadley driving with 2 rough-looking men beside him. "Quincy," she called, backing toward the house. Quincy emerged from the barn, immediately sensing trouble. He moved to stand between Josephine and the approaching wagon, his hand resting near the revolver on his hip. "Afternoon, Hadley," he said evenly as the wagon stopped. "What brings you out this way?" Hadley's gaze slid past him to Josephine. "Just checking on my investment. Heard you paid a pretty penny for the O'Malley girl. Thought I might make you an offer to take her off your hands. I'll give you 900, that's 100 more than you paid." Josephine felt ill at the hungry look in Hadley's eyes. "Miss O'Malley isn't for sale," Quincy replied, his voice hard. "And she's not an investment, she's my employee," Hadley laughed. "Employee, that's what you're calling it," he leered at Josephine. "Bet she earns her keep in ways beyond cleaning." Quincy's hand moved to his gun. "You'd best watch your mouth, Hadley." "Or what?" "You'll shoot me for speaking the truth," Hadley spat. "Everyone knows why a man buys a pretty girl at auction." "I didn't buy her. I paid her father's debt so she could be free." "Free?" Hadley's face darkened. "That's not how it works, Nash. I've got the law on my side. That girl was legal tender for a debt. If you're not using her as property, I have every right to challenge the sale." "Get off my land," Quincy growled. Hadley nodded to his companions. "I've got witnesses that you just threatened me. Sheriff will be interested to hear about that." He flicked the reins. "This ain't over, Nash. Not by a long shot." As they drove away, Josephine approached Quincy, her arms wrapped around herself. "He'll be back, won't he?" Quincy's jaw was tight as he watched the wagon disappear. "Probably. Men like Hadley don't give up easily." "What will we do?" He turned to her, his expression softening. "First thing, we need to make sure that sale can never be challenged." He ran a hand through his hair. "I need to ride into town. Will you be all right here with Mrs. Larson until I return?" "Yes, but what are you going to do?" "See a lawyer. There has to be a way to ensure your freedom legally." True to his word, Quincy returned that evening with Franklin Porter, Fort Benton's only attorney. The balding man with spectacles reviewed the bill of sale while they sat around the kitchen table. "It's legally binding," Porter confirmed. "But Hadley's right, the law views this as a property transfer. If Mr. Nash isn't exercising his rights as your owner, someone could challenge the validity of the transaction." Josephine's stomach churned. "So I could be auctioned again?" "Not if we change your status," Porter said. "There are 2 clear options. The first is formal manumission. Essentially, Mr. Nash would free you from servitude. However, as a single woman without property or family protection, you'd be vulnerable to new claims, particularly since your father's other creditors might come forward." "And the second option?" Quincy asked quietly. Porter cleaned his spectacles. "Marriage. As Mr. Nash's wife, you'd be under his legal protection, and no one could make claims against you without going through him." A heavy silence fell over the room. "There has to be another way," Quincy finally said. "None that would be as legally sound," Porter replied. "I can draw up the papers for either option." After Porter left, Josephine and Quincy sat in uncomfortable silence as Mrs. Larson busied herself in the other room. "I'm sorry," Quincy finally said. "I never meant to put you in this position." "You saved me," Josephine replied. "Without you, I'd be." She couldn't finish the thought. "I'll support whatever you choose. If it's manumission, I'll help you get established somewhere Hadley can't reach you. Maybe Denver or—and if it's marriage?" she asked quietly. Quincy met her gaze, something unreadable in his eyes. If that's your choice, I'd honor it as a legal arrangement only. You would have my name and protection, but I would make no demands of you. When it's safe, if you wish to leave, I wouldn't stop you. Josephine considered his words. A marriage of convenience to a man who'd already shown her more kindness than anyone in her life. And where would I stay? Would you still sleep in the barn? A flush crept up his neck. I could build a wall in the bedroom, or add another room to the house. The thought of Quincy spending nights in the barn through the coming Montana winter while she took his bed made her heart ache. That seems unnecessary for a husband and wife, even in name only. His eyes widened slightly. Are you saying you choose marriage? I'm saying I need time to think, she replied carefully, but I won't leave you sleeping in a barn regardless of what I decide. That night, Josephine couldn't sleep. She paced the small bedroom, weighing her options. Freedom was all she'd wanted, but freedom without safety was its own kind of prison. And marriage to Quincy Nash. The thought stirred something unexpected within her. He was kind and honorable, and sometimes she caught him looking at her in a way that made her breath catch. At dawn, she found him milking the cow in the barn. I've made my decision, she said. Quincy set aside the milk pail and stood, waiting. I'd like to accept your offer of marriage, she said. A legal arrangement, as you suggested. Relief and something else flickered across his face. You're certain? Yes, but I have conditions. She took a deep breath. First, I'll continue working for wages. I want to contribute to the household and have my own money, he nodded. That's fair. Second, I want your promise that if feelings should change for either of us, we'll speak honestly about it. His gaze intensified. Feelings? This starts as an arrangement, but we'll be living as husband and wife in the eyes of others. It seems sensible to acknowledge that might affect us over time. A long moment passed between them. I agree to your conditions, he finally said, and I have one of my own. Yes, that you'll always tell me if you're unhappy or if I've done something to upset you. I don't want you staying out of obligation if you're miserable. I agree, she said softly. Then I'll ride back to town and make the arrangements. Would next Saturday be acceptable? Josephine nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of what they were agreeing to. Saturday is fine. The wedding was a simple affair at the town church. Mrs. Larson had helped Josephine alter an old dress of hers, dyeing it pale blue and adding lace at the collar and cuffs. A small gathering of Quincy's neighbors attended, curious about the quiet rancher's sudden marriage. Josephine felt strangely calm as she spoke her vows, Quincy's steady gaze and firm hands anchoring her. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Quincy hesitated only briefly before leaning down to place a gentle kiss on her lips, their first touch of that kind. It was over in an instant, but the warmth lingered on her mouth as they turned to face the small crowd as Mr. and Mrs. Nash. Wilbur Hadley was notably absent, but his presence hung over the celebration nonetheless. Josephine caught whispers among the townsfolk's speculation about the hasty wedding and knowing looks exchanged when Quincy placed his hand protectively at the small of her back. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Donovan approached. "Congratulations to you both," he said, though his expression remained serious. "Might have a word, Nash." Quincy nodded to Josephine to wait by the wagon before stepping aside with the lawman. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Hadley's been making accusations in town. Says I stole what was rightfully his. Can he do anything about it now that we're married? Sheriff doesn't think so, but he warned me Hadley's not one to let things go. We should be careful for a while." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both lost in thought about what their new status meant. As they approached the house, Quincy suddenly pulled the wagon to a stop. "What is it?" Josephine asked. Without answering, he set the brake and came around to her side of the wagon. "My mother would tan my hide if she knew I didn't do this properly," he said, and before Josephine could ask what he meant, he'd lifted her into his arms. "Quincy," she gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his neck. "A bride should be carried over the threshold," he explained, a hint of a smile playing at his lips as he carried her to the house and through the door with surprising ease. Once inside, he set her down gently, but didn't immediately step back. For a breathless moment, they stood close enough that Josephine could feel the warmth of him, see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nash," he said softly. "Thank you." "Husband," she replied, testing the word. Something shifted in his expression, and he took a deliberate step back. "I'll bring in your things." That night, despite Josephine's insistence that they could share the bed with a bolster between them, Quincy made up a pallet on the floor. "You take the bed," he said firmly. "I'll sleep here." "This is ridiculous," she argued. "The bed is big enough for both of us if we're careful. I made a promise to respect the boundaries of our arrangement, and sleeping on the floor of your own bedroom is respecting boundaries." "Yes," he said simply, and that was the end of it. Josephine lay awake long after Quincy's breathing had deepened into sleep, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person in her room. Her husband. The thought was both terrifying and oddly comforting. The days following their wedding established a new routine. They worked side by side during the day, Josephine taking over most of Mrs. Larson's duties, as the older woman reduced her hours, and in the evenings, they shared meals and quiet conversation. Each night, Quincy slept on his pallet on the floor, and each morning, Josephine found it neatly rolled away before she woke. 2 weeks after the wedding, they made their first trip into town together. Josephine felt the stairs as they walked from the general store to the post office, Quincy's hand resting lightly at her elbow. "Mrs. Nash," called a woman's voice. Martha Jenkins, the banker's wife, approached with a tight smile. "We missed you at the Ladies' Aid meeting yesterday." "I was unaware of it," Josephine replied politely. "Oh, I would have thought Mrs. Larson would mention it. All the respectable married ladies attend." Her emphasis on respectable wasn't subtle. "My wife was busy helping me with the ranch," Quincy interjected. "But I'm sure she'd be welcome at future meetings." Martha's smile thinned further. "Of course, though some of the ladies have questions about your sudden marriage. Our marriage is our business," Quincy said firmly. "Good day, Mrs. Jenkins." As they continued down the street, Josephine whispered, "They're all talking about us. Let them talk. They'll find something new to gossip about soon enough." Before they could reach their wagon, Wilbur Hadley emerged from his saloon, blocking their path. "Well, if it isn't the happy couple," he drawled, alcohol heavy on his breath despite the early hour. "Settled into married life, have you, Nash?" Quincy's hand tightened on Josephine's arm. "Step aside, Hadley." "You know, I've been thinking," Hadley continued, ignoring him. "That O'Malley debt was mighty convenient. Almost like someone arranged for Thomas to lose big that night before he disappeared." Josephine stiffened. "What are you saying about my father?" Hadley's bloodshot eyes fixed on her. "I'm saying maybe he didn't run off. Maybe something worse happened to him." "That's enough," Quincy growled. "You're drunk and talking nonsense, am I?" Hadley sneered. "Sheriff's been asking questions too, about where Thomas O'Malley might have gone or if he went anywhere at all." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. Her father had been a deeply flawed man, but the thought that he might be dead rather than simply having abandoned her was unbearable. "I said that's enough." Quincy stepped forward, putting himself between Josephine and Hadley. "Or what? You'll shoot me in broad daylight," Hadley laughed. "You paid too much for damaged goods, Nash. She wasn't worth your life savings." Quincy's fist connected with Hadley's jaw before Josephine could blink. The saloon owner stumbled back, falling hard onto the dusty street. "My wife is worth everything I have and more," Quincy said, his voice deadly quiet as he stood over Hadley. "If you ever speak of her that way again, you won't walk away with just a bruised jaw." He turned, taking Josephine's arm gently. "Let's go home." They were halfway back to the ranch before Josephine found her voice. "What if he's right? What if something happened to my father?" Quincy glanced at her. "Do you believe that?" "I don't know. He was many things, but he never disappeared for more than a day or two before. And to leave me to pay his debts." She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. "We could ask the sheriff to look into it," Quincy offered, "if it would give you peace of mind." "Would you do that? Even though it has nothing to do with you?" Quincy's hands tightened on the reins. "You're my wife. Your concerns are mine now." Something warm unfurled in Josephine's chest at his words. "Thank you." That night, as Quincy prepared his pallet, Josephine sat on the edge of the bed watching him. "You called me your treasure today," she said quietly. He paused, not looking up. "When?" "When you hit Hadley, you said I was worth everything you have and more." She took a breath. "Did you mean that, or was it for show?" Slowly, Quincy turned to face her. In the lamplight, his expression was unguarded for once. "I meant it." "Why? You barely know me." He knelt on his pallet, considering his words carefully. "I know enough. I know you're kind to Mrs. Larson even when she's being nosy. I know you sing to yourself when you think no one's listening. I know you saved a bit of your breakfast for that stray cat 3 days in a row." Josephine blushed. "You noticed all that. I notice everything about you," he admitted quietly. The air between them seemed to thicken. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. "Quincy, we should sleep," he said abruptly, lying down and turning away from her. "Early start tomorrow." Frustrated, Josephine blew out the lamp and lay in darkness, listening to Quincy's deliberately even breathing. He noticed everything about her, yet maintained this careful distance. And despite her best efforts to honor their arrangement, she was finding it increasingly difficult to think of him as merely her protector. 3 days later, Sheriff Donovan rode out to the ranch. Quincy met him at the corral, and Josephine watched through the window as they spoke, the sheriff's expression grave. When they came inside, she knew immediately something was wrong. "Mrs. Nash," the sheriff greeted her, removing his hat. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." "About my father?" "Yes, madam. A body was discovered in Eagle Creek yesterday. We believe it's Thomas O'Malley." Josephine sank into a chair, Quincy immediately at her side, his hand on her shoulder. "You're certain?" she whispered. "Not entirely. The body's been there a while, since spring thaw at least. But the clothes match what folks remember him wearing, and there was a pocket watch with your mother's picture inside." Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. Despite everything, he was still her father. "How did he die?" The sheriff exchanged a look with Quincy. "Hard to say for certain, but there was evidence of foul play. He had wounds consistent with a beating, and his hands were bound." "Murder," she whispered, horror dawning. "Someone killed him." "It appears that way. I'll need you to come identify what belongings we recovered when you're ready." After the sheriff left, Quincy held Josephine as she wept, his arms strong and secure around her. "I'm sorry," he murmured into her hair. "So sorry. Who would want to kill him? He was just a drunk who couldn't stop gambling." Quincy was silent for a long moment. "Hadley's words the other day about your father's debts being convenient, it makes me wonder." Josephine pulled back to look at him. "You think Hadley had something to do with it? I don't know, but the timing is suspicious. Your father disappears. Suddenly you're being auctioned off for his debts, and Hadley seems mighty interested in acquiring you. But why? I'm nobody." Quincy's hand gently brushed a tear from her cheek. "You're not nobody, Josephine." And you're certainly not nothing to Hadley, though I can't fathom why his interest runs so deep." The following day, they went to town together to identify Thomas O'Malley's belongings: a tarnished pocket watch, a worn leather wallet, and a small key that Josephine didn't recognize. "Any idea what this might open?" Sheriff Donovan asked. Holding up the key, she shook her head. "I've never seen it before." The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. It looks like a safe deposit box key, but according to the bank, your father didn't have one." As they left the sheriff's office, Josephine noticed Wilbur Hadley watching them from across the street, his gaze calculating. A chill ran down her spine. "He's watching us," she whispered to Quincy. "I see him," Quincy replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "Don't look at him." "We're going straight to the wagon." But before they could reach it, Hadley crossed the street to intercept them. "Heard the sad news about Thomas," he said, not sounding sad at all. "Terrible thing." "Excuse us," Quincy said curtly, trying to steer Josephine around him. Hadley stepped into their path again. "I understand the sheriff found some interesting items on the body. A key, perhaps." Josephine froze. "How could he possibly know that?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Quincy replied evenly. "No." Hadley's smile was cold. "Well, if you happen to find anything that might have belonged to me among Thomas's effects, I'd appreciate its return." "My father didn't have anything of yours," Josephine said. "Are you certain about that, Mrs. Nash? Your father and I had some private business arrangements. He might have kept documentation. If you have a claim against Thomas O'Malley's estate, take it to the sheriff," Quincy said. "Now stand aside." This time when they moved to pass, Hadley let them, but his parting words followed them. "That key won't do you any good without knowing what it opens. But I know, Mrs. Nash, I know exactly what your father was hiding." In the wagon, Josephine's hands trembled. What did he mean? What could my father possibly have had that would interest Hadley? "I don't know," Quincy admitted, "but I intend to find out." "Your father's murder, Hadley's obsession with acquiring you, and now this mysterious key, they're all connected somehow." Back at the ranch, they discussed possibilities late into the evening. "If it is a safe deposit box key, it could be from another town," Josephine suggested. "My father traveled sometimes for work when I was younger." "What kind of work did he do?" "He was a bookkeeper for various businesses. He was good with numbers before the drinking got bad." Quincy considered this. A bookkeeper would have access to financial records. Maybe he saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Like Hadley doing something illegal. It's possible. Hadley's not exactly known for his honest business practices. As night fell, they reluctantly set their discussion aside. Quincy prepared his pallet as usual, but this time Josephine caught his hand. "Don't sleep on the floor tonight," she said softly. His eyes widened. "Josephine." "I don't want to be alone, not after today." She swallowed hard. "Just hold me, please." After a moment's hesitation, Quincy nodded. "If you're sure." That night, for the first time, they shared the bed, a respectable distance between them at first, until Josephine's quiet tears drew Quincy's arms around her. She fell asleep with her head on his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, feeling safer than she had in months. When she woke in the morning, Quincy was already gone from the bed, but the impression of his body remained beside her. She found him in the kitchen making coffee, a slight flush creeping up his neck when he saw her. "Thank you," she said simply. "For last night," he nodded once. "Anytime." The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Sheriff Donovan again, looking troubled. "Sorry to disturb you folks so early, but there's been a development. Someone broke into my office last night and went through Thomas O'Malley's personal effects." "The key," Josephine gasped. "Was it taken?" "That's the strange thing, no. Everything was left, just thoroughly examined. Like they were looking for something else," Quincy frowned, "or confirming what was there." The sheriff nodded grimly. My thoughts exactly. I came to warn you both to be careful. I don't know what's going on, but Thomas O'Malley's death wasn't some random violence, and whoever killed him might not be finished with his family. After the sheriff left, Quincy turned to Josephine with determination. Pack a bag. We're leaving for a few days. Leaving? Where are we going? Helena. If that key opens a safe deposit box, it might be there. It's the closest city where your father might have done business. But the ranch, I'll ask Jim Hollister to look after the place. He owes me a favor. Quincy took her hands in his. I won't risk your safety, Josephine. Not when someone's clearly willing to kill for whatever secret your father was keeping. They left within the hour, taking Quincy's fastest horses and avoiding the main road out of Fort Benton. As Montana's landscape rolled by, Josephine found herself drawing closer to Quincy, both physically and emotionally. This man who'd started as her savior was becoming something else entirely, a partner, a protector, and perhaps, if she dared to hope, something more. Helena was a bustling city compared to Fort Benton, with grand buildings lining Last Chance Gulch, where gold had been discovered over a decade earlier. They checked into a modest hotel, Quincy requesting a room with 2 beds, maintaining the propriety of their arrangement despite having shared a bed the night before. They visited 3 banks before finding one where the teller recognized the key's design. This is one of ours, the young man confirmed. If you're the box owner, I can take you to it now. It would have been registered to Thomas O'Malley, Josephine explained. I'm his daughter. The teller checked a large ledger. Yes, we have a box under that name. Do you have documentation proving you're the heir? Quincy produced the marriage certificate and bill of sale from the auction. My wife had no other family. As her husband, I'm requesting access on her behalf. The bank manager was called to review the unusual documents but eventually approved their request. Very well, Mr. and Mrs. Nash. This way, please. The safe deposit box was small, containing only a leather-bound ledger and an envelope. With trembling fingers, Josephine opened the ledger first. It's in my father's handwriting, she confirmed, scanning the pages. These are accounting records, but she frowned. The numbers don't make sense. There are shipments recorded here worth far more than anything Fort Benton usually sees. Quincy looked over her shoulder. Those aren't normal trade goods. Look at the notations: white china, dream powder, black sleep. These are code words for opium shipments. Josephine stared at him in shock. Opium? My father was involved with opium smuggling, not just involved. Based on these records, he was keeping books for someone running a major operation. Quincy's expression darkened. And I'm betting that someone was Hadley. Josephine opened the envelope next. Inside was a letter addressed to her in her father's handwriting, along with several bank drafts. My dearest Josie, she read aloud, voice shaking. If you're reading this, I've likely met a bad end. I've made terrible mistakes and fallen in with dangerous men. Wilbur Hadley has been smuggling opium from Canada and using my bookkeeping skills to hide his operation. I turned a blind eye for money at first, but recently discovered he's been cutting the opium with poison, causing deaths across the territory. Josephine paused, tears filling her eyes. Quincy placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and she continued. I've made copies of his records as insurance, but Hadley discovered my betrayal. I'm leaving these funds for you, money I skimmed from Hadley's operation. It's blood money, but it might keep you safe. Run as far from Fort Benton as you can. Hadley will never let you be if he finds you. He believes you know something because I told him I shared everything with my daughter to protect you. It was a lie, but he'll never believe that. I'm sorry for everything. Your loving father. Silence fell as Josephine folded the letter, tears streaming down her face. He was trying to protect me in his own misguided way. And Hadley's been after you because he thinks you have information that could destroy him, Quincy concluded. The smuggling operation, the tainted opium that's enough to hang him. We need to take this to the sheriff, Josephine said. Not in Fort Benton, Quincy replied firmly. We can't trust that Hadley doesn't have influence there. We'll take it to the federal marshal in Helena. They spent the afternoon providing statements to Marshal Williams, a stern-faced man who examined the ledger with great interest. This is exactly what we've been looking for, he confirmed. We've had reports of opium deaths across the territory but couldn't pinpoint the source. These records give us names, dates, shipments, everything we need to shut down Hadley's operation. Will it be enough to arrest him for my father's murder? Josephine asked, the marshal's expression sobered. Murder is harder to prove, but smuggling tainted opium that's killed people, that'll put him away for life if not get him hanged. What do we do now? Quincy asked. You two should stay in Helena until we make the arrests. It's not safe for you in Fort Benton until Hadley's behind bars. They returned to their hotel room in silence, the weight of the day's revelations heavy between them. Josephine sat on one of the beds, twisting her wedding ring, a simple gold band Quincy had purchased for their hasty ceremony. I never imagined my father was mixed up in something like this, she finally said. All those years, I thought he was just a drunk who couldn't stay away from cards. Quincy sat beside her, close but not touching. People are complicated. He made terrible choices, but in the end he tried to protect you. By lying to Hadley that I knew everything. She gave a hollow laugh. Some protection. He probably thought Hadley wouldn't harm you if he believed you had information that could destroy him. Insurance, in a way. Josephine nodded slowly. But it backfired. Instead of keeping me safe, it made me a target. A target I put a stop to when I outbid Hadley at that auction, Quincy reminded her. Maybe your father's plan worked after all, just not the way he intended. She looked up at him then, really looked at this man who'd given up everything to save her. Why did you do it, Quincy? Why did you really spend your life savings on a stranger? His blue eyes held her steadily. You weren't a stranger. Not really. I'd seen you around town for years at church, at the general store, helping old Mrs. Peterson with her garden. I saw your kindness, your quiet dignity despite your father's reputation. He paused. And that day, seeing you on that auction block, something in me just broke. The thought of someone like Hadley laying hands on you was unbearable. So it was pity, she said softly. No. He took her hand gently. It was admiration, and maybe something more that I wasn't ready to name. Josephine's heart quickened. And now? Are you ready to name it now? Instead of answering, Quincy leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, his lips met hers in a kiss unlike the brief, chaste one they'd shared at their wedding. This was tender but insistent, a question and an answer all at once. When they finally parted, Josephine was breathless. I think that's a pretty clear name, she whispered. Quincy smiled, the first full, unguarded smile she'd seen from him. I've been falling in love with you since the day I brought you home, Josephine Nash, maybe even before that. I love you too, she admitted, the words bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. I've been fighting it because of our arrangement, but I don't want to fight it anymore. Neither do I. He brushed her tears away with his thumb. When this is all over, when we're safe, I want us to start our marriage fresh, not as an arrangement or a legal necessity, but as a real partnership. If you'll have me. I'd like nothing more, she said, leaning in to kiss him again. That night they shared a bed not out of necessity or comfort, but desire. Quincy's touch was gentle, reverent, as he showed Josephine exactly how precious she was to him. And for the first time in her life, Josephine truly felt like a treasure. 3 days later, Marshal Williams arrived at their hotel with news. "We've arrested Hadley and 3 of his associates. Found a warehouse full of opium in Fort Benton, just like your father's ledger indicated." Hadley's singing like a bird to save his own neck, including confessing to ordering Thomas O'Malley's murder. Relief washed over Josephine. So it's over. For Hadley, yes. He'll hang for the deaths caused by the tainted opium, if not for your father's murder specifically. His operation is dismantled. You're safe to return home whenever you're ready. After the marshal left, Quincy took Josephine in his arms. "It really is over," he murmured against her hair. "No," she corrected, looking up at him with a smile. "It's just beginning." Their return to the ranch was like coming home anew. The land seemed more vibrant, the cabin more welcoming. Even the cattle looked pleased to see them, if such a thing were possible. Jim Hollister had kept everything in good order, and Mrs. Larson welcomed them with fresh bread and knowing looks at their joined hands. "About time," she muttered, though her eyes twinkled. "Thought I'd go to my grave waiting for you two to figure things out." That evening, after Mrs. Larson had gone home and they were alone, Quincy brought out a small wooden box. "I have something for you," he said, suddenly shy. "I should have given it to you when we were married, but it didn't seem right then." Inside the box was a delicate gold ring with a small pearl surrounded by tiny sapphires. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I'd like you to have it if you want it. A proper engagement ring, even if we did things out of order." Josephine's breath caught. "It's beautiful." "Like you," he said simply, sliding it onto her finger beside the plain wedding band. "We did do things rather backward, didn't we?" She laughed softly. "Marriage first, then falling in love, then engagement." "I wouldn't change it," Quincy said, drawing her close. "Every step brought us here." 6 months later, Fort Benton was blanketed in snow as Christmas approached. The Nash Ranch had undergone significant changes. A new room had been added to the house, the barn expanded, and a proper chicken coop built. With the money from Thomas O'Malley's bank drafts, which Marshal Williams had surprisingly allowed them to keep, calling it restitution, they had purchased additional cattle and hired 2 ranch hands. Inside the cozy cabin, a pine tree stood decorated with paper stars and strings of cranberries that Josephine had made. A fire roared in the hearth, and the smell of gingerbread filled the air. Quincy entered, stomping snow from his boots. "Storm's coming in." "The men have secured the north pasture herd in the shelter." Josephine turned from her cooking, a hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. Their first child, due in late spring, was already making its presence known. "Good. Mrs. Larson just left. She finished the baby blanket." She nodded toward a soft white bundle on the rocking chair. Quincy hung his coat and crossed to her, laying a gentle hand over hers on her stomach. "How are my treasures today?" "We're well," she smiled up at him. "Though your son has been particularly active." "Son, is it? Yesterday you were certain it was a girl." "A mother knows these things," she said with mock seriousness. "And today I know it's a boy who will have his father's blue eyes and stubborn chin." Quincy laughed, pulling her close. "As long as he has his mother's heart, I'll be content." Later, as they lay before the fire, Quincy reading aloud from a book while Josephine mended one of his shirts, a contentment settled over them both. "You ever think about how differently things could have gone?" she asked suddenly. "If you hadn't been at that auction," Quincy set down his book. "Sometimes. But then I remember something my father told me once. The right path doesn't always look right at first, but you'll know it by the peace it brings you in the end." "And does this path bring you peace?" she asked, eyes searching his. "More than I ever imagined possible." He kissed her forehead. "You and our child are the greatest treasure I could have asked for, worth every penny of that life savings and more." "Even though you didn't know what you were getting when you bid on me," she teased. "Oh, I knew," he said seriously. "I knew I was getting the chance to love the most remarkable woman I'd ever met. Everything else, the revelations about your father, Hadley's crimes, even this little one," he touched her belly gently, "that's all just been part of our journey." The fire crackled and outside the wind began to howl, but inside the Nash home, all was warm and secure. Josephine Nash, once auctioned for her father's debts, had found not just safety but love in the arms of a quiet cowboy who had seen her worth from the beginning, who had called her treasure and made her believe it. As the Montana winter raged outside their window, inside they built the foundation of a future filled with love, children, and the deep, abiding partnership of two souls who had found each other against all odds in the wild expanse of the American frontier. 5 years later, the Nash Ranch had grown prosperous. Additional acreage had been purchased, the herd had tripled in size, and the cabin had been expanded into a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a study, and a wrap-around porch where Josephine liked to sit in the evenings, watching their children play. 4-year-old Thomas, named for her father despite everything, had Quincy's blue eyes and quiet determination. His 2-year-old sister Elizabeth, Libby for short, was all Josephine with her dark curls and quick smile. And the newest addition, 6-month-old James, slept peacefully in Josephine's arms as she rocked him on the porch swing. Fort Benton had changed too. The railroad had finally reached the town, bringing new settlers and prosperity. The dark days of Wilbur Hadley's criminal enterprise were a distant memory, though Josephine sometimes still woke from nightmares of the auction block. On those nights, Quincy would hold her close and whisper that she was safe, that she was loved, that she was his greatest treasure until the memories faded and she could sleep again. As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Quincy joined her on the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her, then carefully lifted sleeping James from her arms. "Our boy's getting heavy," he remarked, settling the infant against his shoulder with practiced ease. "He's growing like a weed, just like his father." Josephine smiled, watching Thomas and Libby chase fireflies in the yard. "I got a letter from Marshal Williams today," Quincy said, sitting beside her. "Hadley died in prison last week." Josephine was silent for a moment. "I should feel something, I suppose. Relief maybe, but I just feel nothing. That's because he stopped having power over us long ago." Quincy took her hand, his thumb rubbing over her wedding ring. "We've built something too strong for his shadow to touch." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you remember what you said to me that day in Helena, about wanting to start our marriage fresh?" "I remember every word." "I think we did even better than that. We didn't just start fresh, we built something entirely new." She gazed out at their thriving ranch, their beautiful children. "Something neither of us could have imagined that day at the auction." Quincy pressed a kiss to her temple. "The best bid I ever made." "The only bid you made," she corrected with a laugh. "You spent everything you had, and got everything I wanted in return." His voice grew serious. "You know, all those years ago when I was saving every penny, I thought I was working towards some grand plan, a bigger ranch, more cattle, prosperity. Instead you got a wife with a notorious father and dangerous enemies." "I got a partner," he corrected. "Someone to share the work and the rewards, someone to build a legacy with." He nodded toward their children. "And what a legacy it's becoming." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they called the children in for supper. Seated around the table Quincy had built with his own hands, saying grace over food from their own land, Josephine felt a completeness she'd never dared hope for in those dark days before Quincy Nash had entered her life. Later, after the children were asleep and they lay together in the quiet of their bedroom, Josephine traced the lines of Quincy's face with gentle fingers. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "I'm thinking about worth," she replied. "About how sometimes the most valuable things aren't what we expect them to be. Like a stubborn cowboy spending his life savings on a woman at auction," he asked with a small smile. "Like that woman discovering she had more strength than she ever knew," she countered. "And like both of them finding that love was the real treasure all along." Quincy pulled her close. His heart beat steady and true beneath her ear, just as it had been that first night they'd shared a bed, when comfort had slowly begun to transform into love. "My treasure," he whispered as he had 1,000 times before, but the words never lost their power. "My heart, my Josephine." And as they drifted to sleep in each other's arms, safe in the home they'd built together, the legacy of that desperate auction day continued to unfold into something beautiful, a love story written not in the grand gestures of fairy tales, but in the daily acts of devotion that had transformed two broken lives into one whole, magnificent future beneath the vast Montana sky.